So, the exam. Well, I'm going to do that in just a second. So we have just one more meeting, and on Friday I'll try and do a kind of review of some key points, sum up where we've got to, and then that's us. And all that will be left is the exam. And I just want to say something about the format of the exam. On Friday we will give out a set of 12 questions. So a set of 12 study questions, like that, if you see what I mean. Right. I mean, that's a kind of artist's impression. When you get the exam itself will be 6 of those questions from the study questions, word for word, and your task will be to answer 3 of them. So there should be no disagreeable surprises on the final exam. I mean, it might be disagreeable, but it won't be a surprise, right? Okay, so that's the kind of format we're thinking of. I have to discuss this a little bit with the GSIs, just exactly what we're going to do, but it'll be like something like that. Okay, is that plain enough, what I'm saying? Okay. I was thinking that after class today we might do student evaluations. So would someone volunteer to pick up, you know what I mean, distribute the forms and take them over to Moses? I mean, Moses Hall. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Okay. So today I want to wrap up on Russell, on knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. And this is Russell's official principle of acquaintance. This is what Russell calls the principle of acquaintance. Every proposition we can understand must be composed wholly of constituents with which we're acquainted. So there's that relation of acquaintance you can stand in to objects or to properties. When you've got a proposition like A is F, the constituents, the A part and the is F part, you must be acquainted with what those signs stand for if you're going to understand the proposition. The idea is that every proposition, however complex it is, consists ultimately of simple terms. Even though that might not be obvious at first, you might have to analyze it to explain what's going on. But there will ultimately be the simple terms, and your understanding of those simple terms will always be explained by your being acquainted with the objects or properties that those terms stand for. And that knowledge of things, this acquaintance, is simpler than any knowledge of truths. To be acquainted with an object is just, how should I say, to have it in your field of consciousness. It's something primal. It's not yet to have thought any, to have had any thought about it. You just encountered the thing. When a headache hits you, you just encounter the headache. Thinking, this headache is agonizing, this headache has lasted a long time. Thinking propositions about the headache comes later. Just the primal encounter with the object itself is what it's calling acquaintance, simpler than any knowledge of truths, and it's what you require for the understanding of a proposition. So is that plain enough what the basic idea here is? And this idea that there's a role for consciousness here is different to the idea that it's causation that does all the work, that causal connections or something like that do all the work. You could have the causal connections without consciousness. That was the thing about blind sight, or indeed the bacterium. Okay? Okay, very good. So one one thing about Russell's view that seems so unsatisfactory is that he thinks you can only be acquainted with your own immediate sensations. That means that when I'm talking, ultimately I understand everything I'm saying as relating to my own immediate sensations. You have no acquaintance with my immediate sensations. When you're understanding what I'm saying, when you're talking, you are interpreting everything that's going on in terms of your own immediate sensations. There's a sense in which, on this picture, we can't really understand one another. You're always ultimately talking about things with which you're acquainted. I'm always ultimately talking about things that I'm acquainted with. And there's no connect between the two. And that really seems, well, it just doesn't sound right. I mean, apart from anything else, it's hard to believe that when we are talking about some political matter or what's going on in class today or something, it seems perfectly obvious that usually you can understand perfectly well what I say, I understand perfectly well what you say. I mean, when I do this thing, if I pause and I say, are we all happy with that? I mean, it would be absurd to do that if there was some reason that, in principle, you could never understand what I said, right? I mean, we just don't, in practice, think that that's right. We think there is such a thing as fully understanding what someone else says. So why couldn't we extend acquaintance and say, can't we be acquainted with medium-sized physical objects? Can't we be acquainted with other people if we're going to have this picture of Russell's? I want to look at that idea that you might extend acquaintance and what the problems are with it, why Russell doesn't do it, and then go back to informative identities. You remember informative identities? We still haven't really got that sorted out. So what I'm going to do then is sort it out, I think, and that's what the thing about points of view will be. I don't know what the GSIs are looking so smug about. You don't think I'm going to sort it out, do you? We'll see. Okay, so that's Russell's basic idea. Every proposition must ultimately be composed of simple terms with whose references we're acquainted. And then the basic question is, can't we extend it? Can't we extend the notion of acquaintance and say, well, you can be acquainted with the medium-sized physical objects, so you and I can be acquainted with the same things, so we can, after all, communicate. Wouldn't that be desirable? Well, Russell's contemporary, G.E. Moore, had an account of acquaintance. He didn't call it acquaintance. He had an analysis of consciousness that is really helpful here, I think. So this is from a classic 1903 paper, The Refutation of Idealism. And Moore's talking about ordinary perception. So the experiences you have just as you look around the room. So you see the squareness of the screen or the writing on the screen, that kind of experience. And here's what he says. When you have a sensation, in every sensation, there are two distinct terms, two elements in any perceptual experience. There's first of all consciousness, and in respect of consciousness, all sensations are the same. Consciousness is generic. And then sensations are obviously different, but where they differ is not in this aspect of being conscious. Where they differ is in their objects. So there are the two things. There's the object of your sensation, the thing of which you're having a sensation, and the relation of consciousness that you stand in to that thing. And the relation of consciousness is always the same. So the picture is, suppose you're having a blue sensation or having a green sensation. Okay, look at this. Now you're having a blue sensation. Look at this. Look at that. Now you're having a green sensation. So what is the difference? And in what are they similar? Well, what's going on is that here you are. There is this relation of consciousness, and then there is the blue thing. And that's all that's going on. So the relation of consciousness is always the same. It's just the same, whether you're being related to a blue thing or to a green thing. What is different when you have the sensation of blueness and when you have the sensation of greenness is the thing of which you're conscious. So this is like Russell's picture. Consciousness here is like Russell's acquaintance. There's just the object on the other end of this relation. And this is a relation like being to the left of. I mean, if you take being to the left of, you can be to the left of practically anything, right? Now I am to the left of a human. Now I am to the left of a desk. You know, you see what I mean? Now I'm to the left of a patch of light. You can be to the left of practically anything, but the relation to the left of is always the same. Similarly, you can be conscious of or acquainted with lots of different things. That relation is always the same. The difference is just in the thing with which you're acquainted. Moore says, when we refer to introspection, when you just think about your own experiences, if you think about your own experiences, say just as you look at the screen, when we do that and we try to discover what the sensation of blue is, it's very easy to suppose that there's just one thing here, that the sensation of blue is just a unity. It's just a kind of fuzzy, phosphorescent blob of blue consciousness, as it were, that pops up in the vision part of your mind. You see what I mean? That's what he's saying anyway. That's how it's natural to think about what's going on. And you don't realize there are these two elements there, the blueness and the consciousness part. See, the term blue, that's easy enough. You look at this, and you get the blue part all right, but the relation of consciousness, what the sensation of blue has in common with the sensation of green, that's extremely difficult to spot. Because if you do it now, if you look at the blue thing, you look at the green thing, and you say, what's there? What's going on? Well, your attention always focuses onto the screen. Do you see what I mean? What you'd really like to do is have your attention focus onto the relation that's holding between you and the object. But you can't do that, in fact. When you try and attend to your experience, your attention always, how should I say, drops through the experience and hits the object you're experiencing. If you just think about ordinary vision right now, it's very hard to introspect the part of the vision that's just about you, if you see what I mean, that's just about your conscious state. When you try and attend to your visual experience, you wind up just staring very hard at the furniture. You see the point? I mean, if you've been in any philosophical discussion, at a certain point there does come a time when you're just all staring very hard at the furniture. You know what I mean? I've had many discussions like that. You say, look, there's a red thing, and consider this red thing. And so what Moore says is, in general, that which makes the sensation of blue a mental fact seems to escape us. It seems, if I may use a metaphor, to be transparent, the consciousness part. You look through the consciousness part and you only get the thing. You only get the blueness. You only get the chair or the person, whatever it is. Yeah? You can try this right now. Try attending to your visual experience. All you wind up doing is attending to the stuff around you. And he says that many people fail to spot the consciousness part is sufficiently shown by the fact that there are materialists. Materialists, this is an unsympathetic diagnosis of materialism, but the idea is that people who think there are only physical objects are people who just say, well, where is this consciousness? And they stare about them wildly, and all they see are the people in the chairs, right? Where's the consciousness? I don't get any consciousness. Yeah, and that's just the point that this thing is transparent, this relation. You can't attend to it directly. Okay, now, Moore's main point in this article is that you're as directly aware of the existence of material things in space as you are of your own inner sensations. There's such a thing as, say, having an afterimage or having a hallucination or something, where you stand in that relation of consciousness to an inner object. But you can also stand in that relation of consciousness to an outer object, to something that's out there, whether you're there or not. And it's not the sense. People who talk about sense data or people who talk about sensory images are supposing that what you get is always a sensory image, and then you have to get beyond the sensory image to get to the outside world. But that's just a mistake, Moore's saying. You get connected in vision to the outside object just as directly as you sometimes get acquainted to an internal object. That's the problem with idealism. Idealism says, or skeptics say, you have to start out with a case where you're directly connected to an inner object and then figure out how on that basis you could ever know about the external world. But he's saying that's just a mistake. There's nothing special about the case where you're having a hallucination. That's weird to think that there's something, that's really the basic case where you're having a hallucination. Suppose you're not having a hallucination, then you really are encountering the external object with this generic relation of consciousness. And that's the basic case. It's not as if there's somehow something else in here. That's the basic case where there's just you and the object you're seeing. That's the whole thing. That's the primitive case. Okay, so that's Moore on extending the notion of acquaintance. Yeah, so you can be acquainted with physical objects just as easily as you can be acquainted with sense data. And apart from anything else, that refutes idealism. So look at that. Okay. Okay. And then if Russell's right, you can take this notion. You could take this notion of acquaintance and say that's where reference begins, with that kind of experiential encounter with the objects around you. That's what you don't have if you're blindsighted, but you do have if you've got ordinary visual experience. If you're blindsighted, you're a causal connection to the object that's letting you give the right answers to questions about it. But in ordinary experience, you are standing in this relation of acquaintance to the object around you. And it's because you're standing in that relation of acquaintance to the object that you know what the sign stands for and you're able to know truths about the object. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, you can't attend to the let me just say word for word. You can't attend to the relation between you and the object. Your attention always falls through and hits the object. Yeah, that's right. Just you and the object, yeah. Very good. Excellent. Very good. Yeah, very good. I don't quite know how Moore himself would have responded, but here's my guess. I mean, of course, you're absolutely right. Brains are involved when you're seeing things around you. Yeah, there's no denying that. The question is, suppose you're considering this conscious experience of a person. Where does the experience relate to what's going on in the brain? I think a natural picture to have, I think the picture that, say, most vision scientists have, that most people who think about these things have, is that the conscious experience comes as the end point of the brain processing. The brain does all this stuff, all these assemblies of neurons fire, they affect each other, and somewhere at the end of it all, a miracle happens and you get sensation. Right? I mean, nobody knows quite what. I mean, a miracle happens is, what should I say? It's not a fully satisfactory explanation of what went on. But you might try and sort that out, right? But it comes at the end of all that processing. That's the idea. Yeah. Another picture, though, is the experience is a relation encompassing the object and the person, and the brain processing is somewhere down here, and it just sustains this relation between you and the object. Yeah? So in virtue of all that processing going on, you can stand in that relation to the object. But that's not to say that the experience itself is all over here. It's not to be thought of as the end point of the processing. Think of the processing as a bit of ongoing dynamics. Do you see what I mean? That sustains your relation to your environment. That's right. Possible. Exactly. Exactly. I think that's Moore's picture. What role does it play? Well, suppose you think of something like picking up an object, right? I have here a simple cup, right? Look, I pick up the cup, right? Well, picking up the cup is clearly just a relation between me and the object. It's not that I picked up something else and only indirectly picked up the cup. Yeah? Picking up the cup is something that, well, that's as direct as it gets, right? What makes it possible for me to pick up the cup is brain processing. I did need a brain to do that. I mean, I wasn't really using it at its full capacity there, but you didn't need a brain to even do that. Yeah. But if you ask, well, what was the brain doing there? It's not that the brain did a lot of stuff and then somewhere deep in the brain, the picking up of the cup happened. The picking up of the cup was out here, my relation to the environment, being made possible by the brain. So the idea is that seeing the cup is like that. Experiencing the cup is like that. It's not that experience is generated back in the brain. Or experiencing the cup is a relation to an object around you, one of the objects around you. And the brain is sustaining that relation, making that relation possible, just as with picking something up. It makes that possible. Yeah. Is that giving the picture anyway? Yeah. Okay. I mean, you see that's quite different to what I think is the usual vision science picture of consciousness, where all this stuff happens in the brain, and then deep in the head, some conscious experience is generated. And if there's something out there, well, there might be something out there and there might not, but the conscious experience will be just the same. That's not the idea here. The idea here is the conscious experience has the object in it. With the brain, yes, I guess it would be simultaneous. Yeah, yeah. Just as with the picking up the cup, you know, there's got to be brain. You need some brain processing kind of warming you up to pick up the cup. Yeah, but they're roughly simultaneous. Okay, so that's extending the notion of acquaintance. It is quite a radical step, this. It pushes consciousness out of the head. It makes it into a relation to your environment. So it's it is not like Descartes' picture of consciousness. It's not like the picture of consciousness we've had so far in the class, where whether I'm conscious or not is one thing and what's around me is another. In this kind of picture, that's like saying, I pick up the things I pick up, but what's my environment? That's a further question. That doesn't make sense, right? That's a contradiction. This is like saying, this picture says, what you're conscious of is the same as the question, what things are around you? Okay, there's a problem for this idea about informative identities. It never really quite goes away, informative identities. The thing is, when you encounter a medium-sized physical object, you don't get your mind round all aspects of the object. You're always encountering an object from one angle or another. You're always aware only, even for a very simple object, you know, you're always aware only of some aspects of it. You know, there are different views of the same thing. That's how come there can be informative identities, even for things that are right in front of you. But if all that was going on is there's you, there's this generic relation of consciousness, and there's the object that you're conscious of, and that's the whole story. How could there be informative identities? How could there be different ways of experiencing the same thing? I mean, all we've got is there's you, there's this relation of consciousness that's always the same, and then there's the object. We don't have enough in the picture to make sense of different ways of experiencing the same object. But there clearly can be different ways of experiencing the same object. So how can you make sense of that? I mean, that's a really basic problem for this picture. If consciousness is just the same, and the thing in terms of which the two sensations differ is the object, and that's the whole thing, well, if the object is the same and the generic relation is the same, the experience is the same. So this is just impossible. You see what I mean? That's a really basic problem for this view. And there are two traditional solutions to this problem of informative identities, both of which we've gone over, but at this point we can probably just zap it up. So one traditional solution is representationalism, different descriptions associated with the two ways of getting the thing. The other is there are special references. Only certain things can be referred to using acquaintance. So suppose you take an informative identity like Sir Percy Blakeney is the Scarlet Pimpernel. Not many people know that. Okay, so suppose we found out that Sir Percy is a Scarlet Pimpernel. How could there be two different ways of being given Sir Percy? How did that happen? Well, the view we looked at such length is you have different descriptions associated with the two signs. You have one set of descriptions associated with Sir Percy, the languid aristocratic fop, and then you have the daring hero of the French Revolution, the Scarlet Pimpernel, saving people from the revolutionaries. So these are different sets of representations. That's how come it can be informative. But the basic problem with this is really already there in Russell, when we were looking at Russell in the third week or so of the term, that what's in those associated representations is going to be something like descriptions, maybe general terms, maybe more singular terms, the son of Peter or whatever. You're going to have more singular terms in these representations. But whatever's in there, whatever's in these sets of representations, whenever you have any kind of representation, you can get mode of presentation phenomena. Whenever you're representing anything at all, there is going to be the way you're representing it. So, okay, we've maybe solved the problem of informative identities for these two terms, but whatever terms we have in here, there's going to be a problem of informative identities for them. There's always going to be, for any term, there's going to be the way it picks out the thing that you're talking about. So at some point this process has to come to an end. I mean, you might say, well, let's look at these terms here. How do we characterize the ways those terms are giving as objects? Well, I use further representations. But then at some point that's got to come to an end. It can't be representations all the way down. There's got to be some point where you solve the problem of informative identities, but not in that way. You see what I mean? In a way, that was Russell's point. You can postpone the problem by talking about these further representations, but the problem is always going to come back up. And if Moore's right, then if we extend acquaintance, then the problem is going to come back up with these simple, where you have the simple acquaintance with physical objects. So what are we going to do here? It's not that there are different representations associated with these two. I mean, this is supposed to be prior to knowledge of truths. So it's not that you're representing it one way here and representing it another way here. This is the bare encounter, the primal encounter with the thing that doesn't involve knowing any truths about it? Well, Russell's own solution was you can't actually do it for physical objects, for medium-sized physical objects. You can only be acquainted with your own sensations. And the great thing about your own sensation is if you've got some fuzzy, phosphorescent blue in your mind, the blue quality in your mind, you can only encounter that in one way. So for some sensation that's in your mind, the problem of informative identities doesn't come up. If you've got a headache and you're encountering your headache, there's only one way you can encounter your own headache. So if you restrict acquaintance in Russell's way, then you can really solve this problem of informative identities. The price is we never really understand each other. And it's actually worse than that. If you're going to say, well, we can be aware only of objects like sense data, of which we've comprehensive knowledge, there are no informative identities. I mean, the thing about the reason you can have informative identities for physical objects is when you encounter the physical object, your encounter with the thing is always partial. You can't see round the back of it, right? You're always encountering it partially. So you can have different partial encounters with the same thing. If it's a sensation in your own mind that you're encountering, you see that you get the thing through and through. It has no back. I mean, it's your sensation. It's in your mind. You know the whole story about it. That's why you can't get an informative identity involving it. But the price there is, first of all, we never really understand each other. And anyway, are we ever going to get knowledge of the physical world at all out of this? You might say, well, I encounter the table or I encounter the chair and I form my conception of what the table or the chair are on the basis of my experiences. But then, how could I ever form the conception of something that wasn't an experience of mine? And all I'm getting is these table-ish sense data. You couldn't, if you were thinking of it like that, ever really understand what it would be for something to be a concrete object out there that you weren't experiencing. And you start out with just inner sensations. You're behind a wall of inner sensations. How could you even frame the conception of what was on the other side of the wall? You would never know. So that's the puzzle. I think that's the hardest. That's when you resolve it. That's why it's so hard, the problem of informative identities. All anyone has been able to think of is, well, it's different descriptions associated with the two signs. But that can't be the end of the story. And if you say, well, no, it bottoms out in something else, what could it be? Okay. So I'll briefly solve the problem and then we'll call it a wrap. So I think that the GS eyes are giving me this look like, what on earth is he going to say now? I think there's a notion of a point of view that is quite intuitive and could actually help here. The reason this problem comes up so sharply is that we're thinking of experience of the object as just a two-place relation. You're thinking, there's you and there's the object, and that's the whole thing. And if that's the whole thing, how can there be different ways of identifying the object? Okay. It can't be, I mean, if there's a single object there that you're encountering in different ways, how could that be? It must be that there are different representations being associated with it, or else it must be an object of a kind that you can't get onto it in two different ways. But although this is very intuitive, this idea that it's just a two-place relation, there's just you and the object. When you just focus on your own current experience of the object, that's a natural way to think about it, there's just me and that. But I think that is not really the right way to think of it. You could think, no, it's a three-place relation. Because after all, when you encounter an object in experience, you are always encountering the object from some point of view or other. You get the object from one angle or you get the object from another angle. So maybe the mistake is just what makes this seem so hard is that it's so natural to think of this as a two-place relation, you and the object. It should instead be thought of as a three-place relation. You are encountering the object from a particular point of view. So by point of view here, the simplest way to think of it is, it's just your location, is where you are with respect to the object. So if you shift position, if you lie underneath the table and get that view of it, that will be a different experience than if you are viewing it from the top. So if you think, well, that would explain how you could have different experiences of the same thing, because you can shift position with respect to the thing. When you think of it, it's not just position that matters, though. I mean, it's got to be something like, well, we've got to know what kind of sensory organs you have. What kind of, a bat in a particular position with respect to a tree is going to have quite different experiences of it if it's using sonar than a human in that position just looking at the tree. Or someone colorblind looking at a blue patch is going to have quite different experiences from someone color-sighted looking at the blue patch. So you've got to factor in things like that to the notion of a point of view. It's got to be things like whether you're color-sighted, whether you're a bat, whether you're touching it or seeing it, what kind of sense organ you're using to get onto it. You need the notion of the type of consciousness that you're using and then the particular vantage point from which you're getting onto the thing. And the vantage point will include things like, well, I said basically your position with respect to the scene, but also the lighting conditions, whether there's anything in between you and it, how good your vision is, whether you're attending to it, those kind of questions, those will all get factored into point of view. So this will be quite compendious, but it won't be factoring in representations. It won't matter what you're representing. This is more basic than you're representing the object. So this is not like a description theory. This is a way of explaining. The thing we began with in this class was Frege's notion of your take on the object. And I say, well, your take on the object is something you describe by characterizing your point of view with respect to the object. And that's not the same thing as saying the descriptions that you're using to identify the object. Right? It's something more basic than that. So then you've got the self encountering the object with a particular style of consciousness, particular sensory organs and so on, and the vantage point. Okay, that's a three-place relation. And with that, we've solved the problem of informative identities. There can be informative identities because, it sounds plain enough. I hope this sounds sensible enough when I say it. You can have informative identities because you can encounter the same object from different points of view. And when I explain what that means, I don't appeal to descriptions or representations, and I don't appeal to anything about the object being inner. But that shows you how an account of singular reference could bottom out, could be content with, could end with the notion of experiential acquaintance with a thing. Yes?
That works for seeing things. What about the informative identity when you say the Scarlet Pimpernel was, what that guy's name was?
Sir Percy Blakeney.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a description. Both of those are either descriptions or names or whatever, but you don't see them. You don't have different points of view with them.
Right. This goes back, I think, to something we were discussing in some questions that came up last time, that I said the causal theory, this is radically opposed to the causal theory, right? But there are going to be a lot of language for which the causal theory is right. I'm not questioning that. Yeah. This thing about the importance of experience, this is only going to be for the fundamental points that get language moving in the first place. Like when you say, this is Sir Percy Blakeney. Yeah, it's the this there that I'm talking about, not the Percy Blakeney part, if you see what I mean. And it's only when you have the this thing in place that you can explain the meaning of the name Sir Percy Blakeney. So we're just talking about the this bit, not the Sir Percy part. Yeah. So you can have the Sir Percy part. I'm just talking about the demonstrative referring to the thing right there. Yeah. Okay. Okay, on that somewhat triumphant note, I think that's the end of the message. Okay, so we'll do a kind of review of where we got to on Friday, but don't go away because we're going to do student evaluations now. We're a little bit short of time, so